Hey everyone. So, right off the bat, I just want to give you a heads up that this is not the video we originally planned to release today. I actually ended up getting sick last week, right on the heels of finishing up the longest deep dive into a single case we've ever done. So, yeah, needless to say, the timing of that wasn't great, and it threw off our production schedule a little bit. We've already started working on a couple of new cases, but unfortunately, we weren't able to get either of them done in time for this week's release. That being said, because I am feeling better now and we didn't want to leave you with nothing, we decided to do a re-release of an older series that we did from a couple of years ago, one focusing on crimes that were solved with the help of pets. For this new video, we decided it would be fun not only to tell these stories with our updated on-camera format, but also to combine all of the previous cases into one big video. With that out of the way, here are Crimes Solved with the Help of Pets. In late 2020, authorities in Buncombe County, North Carolina began investigating the disappearance of a 91-year-old woman named Nellie Sullivan. Nellie was described by those that knew her as a sweet old lady, one without any enemies, and one who wouldn't hesitate to help others. As one neighbor put it, she'd give you the clothes off her back if she could. She was just very kind. This made it all the more disturbing when police began to ask around about Nellie after learning of her disappearance, only to find out that no one could remember seeing the elderly woman for years. When police asked for specifics, all neighbors could tell them was that at the time that she had last been seen, Nellie had been living with her granddaughter, 46-year-old Angela Walmsley, and Angela's husband, 50-year-old Mark Barnes, at a property in the community of Candler. These same neighbors said that they had lost track of the elderly woman, though, because at one point she had fallen ill and had been hospitalized, after which Angela and Mark put her in a nursing home. Nellie had later returned to live with Angela and Mark, but no one had seen her after that. Though they had little additional concrete information, neighbors expressed concern for Nellie's safety, saying that she was often left home alone while living with Angela and Mark, and that the couple would go out at all hours of the day and night. At least one neighbor said that they had brought Nellie groceries on more than one occasion before her disappearance because they were worried that she didn't have any food. In addition to all of these statements from people that knew Nellie, police uncovered one other major piece of information that piqued their suspicions. Despite the fact that no one had seen Nellie for years, her Social Security and retirement benefits were still being collected, and the prescriptions for her medications were still being filled. Naturally, investigators turned their attention to Angela and Mark. It turned out that Angela and Mark were heavy drug users who had a habit of moving around from place to place because of their circumstances. It apparently didn't take much digging for detectives to realize that they were the ones who had been collecting Nellie's retirement benefits, as well as refilling her prescriptions. Despite claiming to have no information about Nellie's whereabouts, it was clear that they wanted authorities to believe that she was alive. In December of 2020, Angela and Mark were arrested and charged with a slew of drug crimes, as well as misdemeanor animal cruelty, unlawfully reconnecting a utility, and 2 counts of abandonment of an animal. Mark was also charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Still, though, authorities didn't have enough to fully connect them to Nellie's disappearance. As the investigation continued, this would change slightly, as the following year both Mark and Angela would be charged with concealing a death just a month apart from each other. However, there was a major piece of the puzzle still missing. Where was Nellie Sullivan? Investigators searched everywhere they could think of, including a property that Mark and his sister had inherited in the town of Black Mountain. Nothing was found. In the meantime, Mark and Angela were uncooperative, repeatedly giving police information that went nowhere. Officers would later say in interviews that the couple was leading them on a wild goose chase. However, that wild goose chase would finally come to an end in the most unexpected of ways. On April 14th, 2022, police were called to a property in Candler with reports of a startling discovery. When officers arrived at the residence, a trailer at 11 Beady-Eyed Lane, they spoke with the occupant who explained the situation. According to the resident, earlier that day they had been chasing after their pet duck when it had run underneath the trailer to avoid being caught. When they made their way underneath to go after the duck, they stumbled across a container, one that they believed contained human remains. Not only did this turn out to be entirely true, but when tests were conducted on the remains, they were found to be those of Nellie Sullivan. During this analysis, investigators also concluded that Nellie had been the victim of a homicide. They believed that she had been killed at a different location and brought to where she was eventually discovered. This address, 11 Beady-Eyed Lane, also happened to be a residence where Mark Barnes and Angela Walmsley had once lived. With this new evidence in hand, the couple were each charged with first-degree murder. Despite the heartbreaking conclusion to the investigation into Nellie Sullivan's disappearance, authorities were happy to finally be able to provide some semblance of closure in the case. Needless to say, they were also grateful for the help from the unlikely feathered hero in the investigation, with one officer from the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office stating, quote, "If I could give that duck a medal, I would." At the time of this recording, Angela Walmsley and Mark Barnes are still awaiting trial for Nellie's murder. On March 13th, 2015, police in Newaygo County, Michigan received a frantic call about a violent incident at a home in Ensley Township. The call had been placed by a woman named Connie Ream, who said that she had discovered the lifeless bodies of her two neighbors, married couple 46-year-old Marty and 48-year-old Glenna Durham. When officers arrived at the scene, they found everything just as Connie had described. The house was in disarray, particularly the living room, which had several broken items strewn across it. In the bedroom, detectives found Marty, who was quickly pronounced dead at the scene. It would later be determined that he had been shot 5 times. Nearby was his wife Glenna, who had been shot once in the head. As officers secured the crime scene, they questioned the Durham's neighbor Connie about the gruesome discovery. She explained that she lived across the street from the couple and that she had decided to check on them after not hearing from them for 2 days. She and her husband Keith were friendly with Marty and Glenna, and it was unusual for them to go even a single day without texting or talking. Based on their first impressions of the crime scene and the state that the Durham's house was in, investigators began to operate under the theory that Marty and Glenna had been the victims of a violent home invasion. With no apparent witnesses, it seemed like detectives would have their work cut out for them. Until roughly an hour into the investigation, when something completely unexpected happened. Though immediately presumed to be dead, someone at the crime scene noticed that Glenna appeared to be breathing. When they reached out to touch her, her eyes momentarily flew open and her body jerked. Glenna was in fact still alive. She was immediately rushed to the hospital for treatment. Unfortunately, while police now had a potential witness to the deadly shooting at the Durham house, it would be some time before she was in any condition to speak with them. However, little did they know that there was another possible witness to the crime, one who would initially be overlooked, but who would eventually provide some of the most startling evidence in the case. More on that in a bit, though. As if Glenna's uncanny survival wasn't enough, investigators soon found themselves with their hands full of bizarre developments in the Durham case. This began a few days after the discovery of the shooting, when Marty's 3 adult children from a previous marriage went to the home. We should point out that sources contradict each other wildly about the nature of this visit to the property, with some stating that the children just went to clean the place, while others allege that they broke in to search around while the home was still an active crime scene, and actually ended up stealing several $100s in cash they found inside. We were unable to determine which of these statements were true, as both seemed to come from equally credible news sources, but we wanted to let you know about the discrepancy for the sake of full disclosure. In any case, the most important part of Marty's children's visit to the house is not disputed. That is, that at some point while inside, they stumbled across a mysterious manila envelope. Inside were what appeared to be multiple notes which had been written to Glenna Durham's 2 adult children from a previous marriage, as well as her ex-husband. The notes appeared to have been written by Glenna and asked her ex to look after her children, and asked her children to forgive her. Another strange development occurred when police were approached by the wife of one of Marty's cousins, who claimed that she practiced psychic readings. When the woman met with investigators, she explained that it was imperative that they look under a couch or love seat somewhere in the Durham home. This is in fact where police found the murder weapon, a Ruger .6 pistol. While it's not exactly clear from reports, it seems that detectives had already recovered the weapon before Marty's cousin-in-law reached out to them. Still, because this detail had not been shared with the family or the public, authorities were suspicious enough to ask the woman where she was at the time of the shooting. She provided an alibi, saying that she was with her daughter. The cousin-in-law was unable to provide any further information to investigators, merely stating that she shared their initial opinion that the Durhams had been victimized by an outside attacker. However, as months began to pass, detectives began to doubt their initial conclusions about the case. This was because the further they dug into the Durhams' personal lives, the more that red flags began to appear. At the time of the shooting, Marty and Glenna had been married for 11 years. By all accounts, they seemed to get along well, though Marty had been in a serious car wreck in 1995 prior to the relationship, which had damaged the left side of his body and left him with a brain injury. As a result, he reportedly couldn't remember his earlier marriage to his first wife, Christina Keller, or the births of their 3 children. About 5 years before he was killed, Marty's condition had gotten worse. He had gone on disability, and Glenna had also started receiving monthly payments from the government for acting as his legally recognized caregiver. It was an arrangement that appeared to work on the surface. However, as police found out through interviews with friends and family and searches through the Durham's financial records, the two had very opposite attitudes when it came to money. Marty was frugal, arguably to a fault. He was apparently the kind of person who was constantly switching off lights and who would keep the heat down even in the dead of winter. There were hobbies that he loved, including hunting, but if he ever wanted anything, he was usually very cautious about the price. Glenna, on the other hand, was known to have a penchant for gambling. According to Marty's brother, during a trip a few years earlier, he had become annoyed because during their visit to see them, it felt like they couldn't go anywhere without Glenna wanting to stop off at a casino. In fact, a search of the couple's financial records showed that in 2010, she had gambled at least $75,000 away at casinos in the area. When police spoke to employees at gas stations close to where the Durhams lived, multiple clerks told them that it wasn't uncommon for Glenna to spend anywhere from $50 to $100 on lottery tickets and scratch cards 3 to 4 times a week. A detailed examination of the couple's finances painted a grim picture. Glenna was the one in charge of making their monthly payments for almost everything, but over several years she had brought them to the brink of ruin with her gambling. They owed money to the IRS, there were outstanding medical bills, and a collections agency almost repossessed one of their cars. Most damning of all, though, was that at the time of the shooting, Marty and Glenna's house was being foreclosed upon. In fact, it was supposed to happen almost exactly at the time the crime scene at their house was discovered. Marty was allegedly clueless about all of this, while his mother had apparently contacted him the month before after seeing a legal notice in the paper about the foreclosure. Glenna had told him afterwards that it was all a giant misunderstanding. In fact, she had not made payments on their mortgage in over a year. To top all of this off, in the days leading up to the shooting, Glenna, who had been on antidepressants, had stopped taking her medication. When state police were finally able to speak with Glenna in October of 2015, they asked her about these seemingly incriminating details, now believing that there was a strong possibility that she had shot Marty before attempting to take her own life. However, Glenna flatly denied any wrongdoing, even after being presented with the notes to her ex-husband and children that had been found at the scene. She said she didn't remember writing them, and if she had left the notes, she certainly wouldn't have included one for her ex. She claimed that she had no reason to kill Marty, stating that if she was truly unhappy, she would have been, quote, better off divorcing him and leaving him. Despite a seemingly compelling case against Glenna, For reasons known only to investigators, they felt that they didn't have strong enough evidence to obtain an arrest warrant for her. Months began to pass, and in the meantime, things began to grow uglier between Marty and Glenna's families. Tensions hit their peak after Marty's cousin-in-law, who had gone to police claiming to be a psychic, took Glenna's side and testified on her behalf during a legal dispute between Glenna and Marty's children over their father's possessions. The cousin allegedly received threats over social media from members of Marty's family, and at one point she found an arrow leaning against her garage door. A message written on one of the veins of the arrow reportedly read, "You're next." Finally, near the one-year anniversary of the shooting, the case would take its last, albeit arguably most unexpected turn, when Marty's ex-wife Christina Keller produced an unexpected witness to the crime. It was Marty's African gray parrot, named Bud. Before we get into exactly what evidence Bud was able to bring to the table, allow me, if you will, to go on a brief tangent about African gray parrots. If you're at all familiar with these animals, then chances are you know that they are some of the most intelligent birds in the world. While their behaviors in the wild are somewhat mysterious because they are apparently notoriously difficult to study, as pets, greys are known for their impressive abilities to mimic sounds and words, even when compared to other parrots of different species. In fact, many of them have been known to sport vocabularies, if you will, of several hundred words. Honestly, it's difficult to describe how unique these little guys are unless you've experienced it for yourself in person. I had the pleasure of interacting with a gray semi-regularly throughout my adolescent and teenage years because one of my best friends had one. The way he could mimic human voices, repeat simple phrases, or even ask for things like his favorite snack of peanuts was pretty mind-blowing. It was also amazing to me how emotionally sensitive these birds are and how incredibly attached they get to people. He had relationships with people, just like any other member of my friend's family. I apologize for the tangent here, but all of this will hopefully add a bit of context to what I'm about to describe next. In May of 2016, with no arrests having been made in connection with Marty's murder, his ex-wife Christina produced an alarming videotape. It was Marty's parrot, Bud, seemingly reenacting the final seconds of his owner's life. The video appeared to show Bud imitating two people in the midst of an argument, with his voice changing back and forth.
Get your moving now!
You see, following Marty's death, Bud had gone to live with Christina. They had gotten Bud while they were married, so it only seemed natural that he should go to live with her once the tragedy had unfolded. However, early on, Bud had begun to exhibit serious signs of stress and trauma, and had started to repeat some version of the previous four-line interaction quite frequently. Christina became convinced that Bud had witnessed Glenna killing Marty, and that the words he was now repeating was evidence of the final chilling moments of a fatal argument between the married couple. Though Christina apparently filmed the disturbing video of Bud shortly after Marty's murder, she hadn't immediately done anything with it, believing that the case would be solved by other means and that this wouldn't be admissible evidence in court anyway. However, by the one-year anniversary of the murder, she and other members of Marty's family had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress or arrests, despite the growing body of evidence against Glenna. That's when Christina handed the tape over to a local TV reporter, hoping that at the very least it would spur public interest in the case. This turned out to be an extremely effective strategy, as news of Bud's chilling revelations soon went viral online. Just weeks later, Glenna was arrested and charged with Marty's murder. For their part, police and prosecutors claimed that the decision to charge Glenna had nothing to do with all of the publicity that the video of Bud attracted. Instead, they pointed to other evidence they had uncovered, like cell phone records taken from Glenna's phone on the day before the crime scene was discovered, which indicated that she had looked up information about the same firearm that had been used as the murder weapon 5 times in less than a 1.5-hour period. Following a trial in 2017, Glenna Durham was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though video of Bud was never introduced as evidence, it's hard not to see him as having had some sort of material impact on the case. This is because, contrary to what police said, if you ask us, the timing of Glenna's arrest seems way too convenient to have been unrelated to the video of Bud. In any case, Glenna Durham currently remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Pittsfield Charter Township, Michigan. When 18-year-old Shantae Huntington left Aurora, Colorado, she was looking for a new start. Having dropped out of high school, she wanted better opportunities than the ones she felt were available to her in her hometown, and was also itching to travel. She decided that Miami was the place to be. There, she hoped to save up enough money to go to cosmetology school. She had made extra cash up until then by styling and cutting her friend's hair, but her dream was to go professional and become a full-time hairdresser. Shantae's boyfriend, Tyree Banks, decided to make the move to Miami with her, and the couple left sometime in January of 2006. One person who wasn't on board with this plan was Shantae's mother, Margaret. It wasn't that she didn't support Shantae, it was quite the opposite. The two of them were extremely close, but the idea of her daughter moving basically all the way to the other side of the country made Margaret nervous. After all, Shantae was still very young, she reasoned, and she worried that her upbeat and friendly nature could make her easy to take advantage of. Though Margaret had begged her not to go, even offering her a car if she would stay in Aurora, Shantae's mind was made up. After a long goodbye, Margaret was finally able to let her daughter go, but made Tyree promise to take care of her. He said he would. Just 6 months later, on the night of May 22nd, 2006, Miami police received a frantic 911 call from Tyree. He said that his girlfriend was missing. When police spoke to Tyree, he explained that earlier that night, at around 7:30 p.m., Shantae had left the Super 8 motel where they were staying on the 3400 block of Biscayne Boulevard, saying that she was going out to get something to eat. After that, he had been unable to reach her, and she had never returned. Understandably, the news of Shantae's disappearance terrified Margaret. As soon as she could, she traveled down to Miami to join the search effort. She also circulated information about Shantae online, using websites like Craigslist to spread the word that she was missing. Sadly, just a couple of weeks later, in early June, the Miami police confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Their counterparts in Palm Beach County had recovered a body. It was Shantae. It turned out that Shantae had been discovered just 1 day after she had been reported missing, in a partially wooded lot in the community of Loxahatchee. The place was about an hour and a half's drive north of where she had disappeared, and she had been discovered by the woman who lived directly across the street. It was obvious that the case was a homicide. Shantae's remains had been wrapped in both a bedsheet and a shower curtain, which had been secured around her nude body with duct tape at her head and feet. An autopsy revealed that she had been strangled. The attack had been vicious enough to break the bone around her throat. Fortunately for detectives, there was physical evidence found at the scene. Some hairs that were not human were found with the remains, but the main focus of investigators was an unknown DNA profile believed to belong to the killer that was recovered from the shower curtain and duct tape. This DNA was entered into state and federal databases, but no matches were found. Naturally, police also turned their attention to Tyree Banks. However, he provided a DNA sample and was ruled out. When investigators dug further into Shantae's life, they learned that she had been working as an escort prior to her death. She had allegedly done this to make ends meet after arriving in Miami and realizing it was much more difficult to support herself financially than she had anticipated. Unfortunately, this only widened the potential pool of suspects without pointing to anyone in particular. After all, Shantae had placed ads for her escort services in a bunch of local papers. With that, the case began to go cold. Despite repeated appeals to the public for information, the investigation remained more or less static for over 3 years. That was, until police caught a lucky break. A 37-year-old man named Guillermo Romero had been briefly arrested on an unrelated charge, but his DNA had been entered into the system as a result. It was a match to the unknown sample in the Shantae Huntington murder investigation. While this gave investigators a prime suspect, for whatever reason, reports state that authorities did not feel that the DNA match alone was enough to charge Romero. It was then that they took a second look at the other major piece of physical evidence in the case, the non-human hairs that had also been recovered from Shantae's body. It turned out that these hairs were from a pair of dogs, but not just any dogs. They were from Akitas, the same breed that were owned by the woman directly across the street from the crime scene, the one who had originally discovered the remains. When police spoke to the woman, Liliana Toledo, they were able to confirm the link to her dogs through DNA analysis. That being said, this DNA was not an exact match. Rather, the dogs that Liliana owned were instead closely related to the ones that had left the hairs. That's when Liliana gave investigators the exact piece of information that they needed. Her dogs had given birth to puppies a few years back, and she had given 2 of them to her former brother-in-law after he had helped to build a kennel for them. The man's name? Guillermo Romero. Thanks to this information, police were not only able to link Romero to the hairs found with Shantae's body, they were also able to connect him to the site where the remains were found. After all, he had been to the Loxahatchee property many times before. Not only that, but police soon discovered that Romero had been working a construction job close to the motel where Shantae had been staying at the time of her disappearance. The final damning piece of evidence came from Liliana's sister, Dagmara Toledo, who was also Romero's ex-wife. She said that she was terrified of her ex-husband, describing him as extremely violent and saying she had a restraining order against him. Moreover, she said that she had separated from Romero in May of 2006, at roughly the same time Shantae went missing. She said that around this period, Romero had talked extensively about hiring escorts that he had found in the local papers. With all of this evidence in hand, police finally arrested Romero in April of 2010 and charged him with first-degree murder. The 37-year-old denied everything, saying that he had never met Shantae and didn't know who she was. Despite building such a seemingly solid case against Romero, it appears that he was eventually allowed to plead to a lesser manslaughter charge in 2013. Frustratingly, we're not sure why this was the case, as none of the information we came across dug into these details or provided any sort of explanation. Romero was sentenced to just 3 years and 4 months in prison for the crime. However, since he had been arrested in 2010 and was given credit for time served, by the time the sentence was handed down, he had served almost the entire thing. He was reportedly released later that year. While this certainly seems like an injustice to us, at the same time, it's important to remember that the case might never have been solved at all if it were not for the rather unique bit of evidence utilized by investigators. We also hope that wherever they are, Shantae's friends and family have been able to find some semblance of closure in the years since her tragic and terrible murder. When 48-year-old Kevin Butler failed to turn up for dinner on Christmas of 2001, those that knew him were understandably worried. Their concern soon turned to horror, however, when a friend of Kevin's went to his apartment in the Dallas neighborhood of Pleasant Grove to check on him. Though Kevin's truck was missing, he was still inside, dead on the living room floor. The scene was gruesome and chaotic. Kevin's arms and legs had been bound with electrical cords, and he had been severely beaten and stabbed several times. A knife wound to the neck had been the fatal blow. Not even Kevin's beloved Parrot had been spared during the attack. His 18-inch tall white-crested Cockatoo, who Kevin had affectionately named after NBA legend Larry Bird, was found dead in the kitchen. Bird had been stabbed in the back with a fork and was also missing a leg. There were feathers scattered all over the apartment. At the same time, it was clear that the place had been rummaged through. In addition to his truck, police would later determine that Kevin's VCR had been stolen, along with approximately $1,200 in cash. Given the circumstances, it was obvious to police that robbery had been at least a partial motivation behind the crime. However, given the brutal nature of the killing, it also seemed like the murder might have been personal. But who could have wanted Kevin dead? According to Kevin's family, he was a kind person who had a deep love for animals. All of the pets that he owned were strays, or were otherwise ones that he had agreed to take in because their owners couldn't care for them anymore. That had been the case with Bird. He had been given to Kevin by a roommate who had to move. Though Bird had been with Kevin for just over 2 years at the time of their deaths, it was obvious how attached the Cockatoo had become to him. However, there was one person who seemed to have it out for Kevin, a 22-year-old man named Johnny Cerna. Cerna had formerly worked for Kevin's pool company until he had altered a check that Kevin had given him to pay for the lining of an above-ground pool. After that, the two had a falling out, one which Cerna refused to let go. It just so happened that Cerna and his half-brother, 30-year-old Daniel Torres, also lived just a block away from Kevin's apartment. When the two were questioned about Kevin's murder, they denied any involvement. However, little did they know they had unwittingly left evidence behind at the scene that said differently. The case took a crucial turn when investigators found blood on both a light switch and Bird's beak that came back as a DNA match to Torres. They confronted Torres and Cerna with the evidence in July of 2002. This time, both of them talked. During questioning, the pair each tried to blame each other for the actual killing. In Torres' version of events, he had merely come to Kevin's apartment out of concern because Cerna had threatened to kill him, and claimed that he had stumbled into the situation after his brother already had Kevin bound up in the living room. He claimed that he stole Kevin's truck because he panicked and wanted to flee the scene. Cerna, meanwhile, claimed that Torres had been behind the killing, and that he had merely looted Kevin's house for valuables while his brother carried out the murder in the other room. While authorities didn't fully believe either of the men's stories, based on the evidence, they ultimately decided that Cerna's version of events was likely closer to the truth. Police alleged that on Christmas Eve, Cerna had wanted to go over to Kevin's house both to confront him about their ongoing feud and rob him, and had convinced Torres to come along. When they got there, things had escalated and they had ended up restraining Kevin and viciously beating him. In a desperate bid to protect his owner, Bird the Cockatoo had swooped down and started pecking and clawing at Torres, who was armed with a knife. Torres had killed Kevin before turning his attention to the Cockatoo. Before dying, Bird had managed to peck and claw Torres' head hard enough to draw blood, some of which he inadvertently left on a light switch in the apartment after touching his wound. Though Bird had been unable to save Kevin or himself, his last heroic effort did provide investigators what they needed to get justice in the case. Both Torres and Cerna were charged and convicted of capital murder, and ultimately received life sentences. During an interview, one of the investigators on the case spoke about how Bird was instrumental to solving the case, and of the obvious bond between him and Kevin. He stated, quote, "Bird died valiantly. There were feathers scattered through the house, and he put up a fight, no doubt about that. Kevin's family and co-workers have told me that you just didn't mess with Kevin while that bird was around." On October 7th, 1994, an abandoned car was found in a field off of Highway 169 near the small community of Tyne Valley in rural Prince Edward Island, Canada. The situation was reported to the local RCMP, who began an investigation. When they did, they almost immediately found cause for concern. There was blood spatter on the windshield, and further trace amounts were discovered in multiple other places in the vehicle's interior. Though the car had been stripped of its license plates, police were able to identify its owner using its unique vehicle identification number. It was registered to Shirley Ann Duguay, a 32-year-old mother of 5 who lived in the community of Richmond, another rural community located about a 10-minute drive south. Police tried to get in contact with Shirley, but were unable to. When they reached out to her friends and family, their concerns only deepened. It turned out none of them could get in touch with Shirley either. After speaking with Shirley's parents and one of her friends, Officers learned that Shirley had last been seen sometime on October 3rd. She had said she was going out to run a few errands, but had never returned. When asked why they hadn't reported her missing, Shirley's parents and friend explained that this wasn't necessarily the first time the 32-year-old had disappeared. However, she had always returned after a couple of days, and that's exactly what they had hoped was the case this time. In addition to this, Shirley's family knew that she was struggling financially and didn't want to draw undue attention to that fact in fear that it would be used as an excuse to take her children away. Particularly, they said, they were worried about her estranged former common-law partner, Douglas Beamish, who they feared would use this as an opportunity to get custody of the 3 of Shirley's children he had fathered. It turned out that Beamish and Shirley had quite the rocky relationship. She had been trying to get out of the situation for some time, and in fact had returned to Prince Edward Island after leaving the place she had been living with Beamish in Toronto 2 years prior. However, he had followed her back east. Ever since then, those that knew Shirley said that she had been doing everything she could to try and move on, and was even seeing someone else. Beamish, however, was persistent. Naturally, this made Beamish a person of interest in Shirley's disappearance. But when police went to speak with him at his parents' house, where he was living at the time, he told them a completely different story. Beamish claimed that things had actually been getting much better between him and Shirley for some time now. He said that the relationship was amicable, and that the last time he had seen her, she had actually given him a ride to work because his vehicle was having problems. He claimed that this had been before she went missing, though, and that he knew nothing about where she might be now. While police remained suspicious of Beamish, there was nothing concrete linking him to Shirley's disappearance. In the meantime, they turned their attention to conducting a formal search. In the following days and weeks, police and teams of volunteers scoured countless areas of interest around Shirley's home and the place where her car had been found. They were aided in their search, first by cadets from the Atlantic Police Academy, and then by 150 soldiers from the Canadian Armed Forces. The searches resulted in 2 important, albeit chilling discoveries. First, a pillowcase and t-shirt were found about a kilometer away from the location of the abandoned car. Authorities theorized that the pillowcase might have come from Shirley's vehicle. Being short in stature, she was known to have kept a pillow in her car, which she sat on while driving to elevate her slightly to better see the road. Disturbingly, both the pillowcase and the t-shirt had noticeable bloodstains on them. About 3 weeks into the search, the second discovery was made. It was a white plastic bag with a Canadian Tire logo on it, which was found to contain a pair of men's shoes and a men's leather jacket. Like the pillowcase and t-shirt, these items were also found to have blood on them. The jacket was also covered in a number of white hairs. Testing would later reveal that the blood from all of these recovered items, as well as the blood found in the abandoned car, were a match to Shirley. Despite these discoveries providing further evidence of foul play in the case, Shirley herself could not be located. By the end of October, the cadets and soldiers who were providing extra help to police and volunteers needed to get back to their regular duties, and with winter fast approaching, soon the search was called off altogether. When police took stock of the evidence they recovered, it made them more suspicious of Douglas Beamish than ever. Both the leather jacket and the shoes were a comfortable size for him, and by this time, police had received information from another witness who claimed that they had observed Beamish having a screaming argument with Shirley around the time of her disappearance. However, it was all circumstantial. So far, all of the blood and DNA evidence was only found to be a match to Shirley. However, there was one last avenue that police had not yet fully investigated: those white hairs that were found on the leather jacket. It turned out that these were actually cat hairs, not human hairs, something that initially came as a disappointment to detectives. That was, until one officer with the RCMP, Roger Savoy, recalled something that would completely change the case. When they had interviewed Beamish at his parents' house, there had been a white cat named Snowball walking around. This gave Savoy an idea. If he could match the hairs found on the jacket to Snowball, then they might be able to link Beamish to Shirley's disappearance. While this was quite the creative solution, Savoy soon learned that this was easier said than done. In fact, it hadn't been done at all, at least not in a criminal case. Keep in mind, this was 1994, so even the use of human DNA in criminal investigations was a relatively new phenomenon. For reference, the first ever conviction based on human DNA evidence had happened just 7 years earlier in 1987. When Savoy began calling up forensics experts in labs across Canada and the US, he was either laughed out of the room or told what he wanted couldn't be done. That was until he reached out to Dr. Stephen J. O'Brien, a geneticist with the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland. Not only did Dr. O'Brien have a PhD in genetics, he was one of the world's foremost experts on feline DNA. Unlike the other experts that Savoy had approached, O'Brien relished both the challenge presented by his request and the idea that his help might aid in solving the case. With that, he agreed to assist in the investigation. After obtaining a subpoena, Savoy obtained a blood sample from Snowball the cat, which was hand-delivered to O'Brien and his team along with the hair that they had recovered in order to maintain a strict chain of custody over the evidence. As a failsafe, O'Brien also had Savoy collect random samples from 19 other cats on Prince Edward Island in order to make sure that there was sufficient genetic diversity amongst the animals so that a DNA match would actually mean something. When the tests were conducted, O'Brien was able to give Savoy the break in the case he had been waiting for. Not only were the DNA samples from the cats sufficiently unique, but the blood evidence they had taken from Snowball was a match to the hairs found on the leather jacket. Sadly, on May 6, 1995, almost exactly 7 months after she disappeared, Shirley Duguay's body was finally found. Her remains were discovered by a trout fisherman who was walking through a wooded area near the village of North Enmore when he stumbled across an area of piled brush that looked out of place. Underneath were Shirley's remains concealed in a shallow grave. The area was about 15 kilometers west of where her car had originally been found. Her hands had been tied behind her back, and an autopsy would reveal that Shirley had been both viciously beaten and strangled. With the results of the cat hair evidence in hand by the time of this horrific discovery, the RCMP wasted no time in arresting Douglas Beamish and charging him with Shirley's murder. When the case went to trial in 1996, Beamish's defense team did their best to discount the cat hair DNA evidence, which had been ruled to be admissible by the judge. They also claimed that without this evidence, the Crown prosecutor's case amounted to very little. Taking a page out of the recent O.J. Simpson trial, Beamish's lawyer even tried to come up with his own snappy catchphrase regarding the evidence, stating, quote, "Without the cat, the case falls flat." Despite this, the prosecution was able to use the cat DNA evidence effectively, successfully tying Beamish to the crime with it while also simultaneously providing a broader body of circumstantial evidence. This came in the form of 2 key witnesses. The first was another former common-law partner of Beamish's, who testified that she had suffered terrifying abuse at his hands during their relationship. In one instance, she said, Beamish had attacked her before dragging her into another room and forcing her to have intercourse with him at knife point. He also threatened to kill her. When it was over, she claimed that he had pulled her out of the room and had beaten her again, this time in front of her children. He then threatened to kill her a second time while still brandishing the knife. Later, while he was in the bath, she claimed that he had called her in and told her that there was no point calling for help because he had cut all of the phone lines. She said that she had checked and found that this was true. The second witness was Beamish's own brother, who testified that he had seen a letter that Beamish had written and sent to Shirley sometime after she had left him and moved back to BEI from Toronto. The brother stated that in the letter Beamish wrote that he had wanted Shirley to return to try and work things out. If she didn't, the letter threatened, there was no point in living and he would kill her and their 3 children before taking his own life. The brother claimed that Beamish had finished the letter by signing his name in blood. At the end of the 9-week trial, the jury found Beamish guilty of second-degree murder, making it the first documented criminal case where animal DNA had been used to secure a conviction. In July of 1996, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 18 years. Though Beamish appealed his case twice, the decision was upheld both times, setting a clear precedent for the use of non-human DNA in criminal cases going forward. At the time of this recording, it appears that Beamish remains in prison. The most recent article we could find about the case was from October of 2022, where he was granted a 12-hour escorted absence from the facility where he was being held in New Brunswick following a parole hearing. During that hearing, Beamish did not request full parole, telling the board that he was, quote, not ready. For the first time, he also took responsibility for Shirley's murder, something he had repeatedly refused to do in the past. When asked what had changed, Beamish explained that he had suffered a series of health problems over the last few years that had changed his perspective, stating in part, quote, I suffered kidney failure and I nearly died a couple of times. When you get to that stage, you realize you need to clean up your past. So that's what I'm doing. I'm cleaning up my past. That being said, the then 63-year-old did express his intentions for the future. Specifically, he stated that he planned to use the 12-hour temporary absence he had been granted to tour a halfway house in the city of Moncton. Beamish told the board he plans to live in the area, if and when he is eventually released. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.